2 minutes for the plenary talk. 2 minutes for the plenary talk. Good morning. We're going to start our plenary talk. So come to the front if you are back at the poster session. Before I start, I'm going to remind you that if you have questions at the end of the talk, there are 2 microphones on the aisle. So stand up and make your questions over there. Also, you can log in to the app with the code that it was on the screen and make the questions through there. Okay, so we're going to start. Our next plenary speaker, Erouscilla Pat Joseph, oversees the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Center. This is the largest volcano and earthquake monitoring network in the Caribbean, a network that provides the governments of 9 contributing territories with an accurate and up-to-date information about geologic activity in the area, which includes 19 live volcanoes. To manage that volcanic threat, the center monitors hydrothermal fluids in the region's islands and maintains a continuously recording seismic network and continuous and campaign-style GPS networks. Its program of hazard mapping and basic geology investigation is complemented by broad education and outreach, work that seeks to help build greater awareness of these volcanoes and the threat that they pose. As Erouscilla will soon expand upon, continuing to fund and sustain this level of monitoring and communication poses a unique set of challenges, as does the need to engage with 9 different governments and disaster management agencies. Clearly, our speaker knows her way around challenge. Under her direction, the Seismic Research Center received the 2022 Volcanic Surveillance and Crisis Management Award from the world's leading global volcanological association. This was in recognition of the superb management of the 2020-21 eruption of La Soufrière in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Today, we are fortunate to have these outstanding volcanologists to help us all learn more about managing some of the challenges that can stand in the way of public safety. Please join me in welcoming Erouscilla Pat Joseph to the SSA stage.
Good morning, colleagues. It is a real pleasure being here today, and I'm truly honored to be invited by the SSA to share with you today. So, as mentioned, the talk today is on volcanism in the Eastern Caribbean, hazards monitoring, challenges, and lessons learned. So I will begin by giving a quick overview of our talk today. A little bit about what we do. I think the introduction gave a really nice little summary. Some natural hazards consideration in the Caribbean context, the hazard impacts of volcanic eruptions, and some lessons learned in the last 70 years from looking at St. Vincent and Montserrat, and some future considerations for monitoring in the region. So a bit about the Seismic Research Center. As previously mentioned, we have been in existence since 1953, and we're located physically in Trinidad and Tobago. That's the southernmost island in the Caribbean archipelago. However, we do monitor the English-speaking islands of the Lesser Antilles, spanning from St. Kitts and Nevis in the north all the way to Trinidad in the south. We provide monitoring of earthquakes, volcanoes to these islands, and we also support efforts of the regional tsunami warning system through our work with the ICG and collaboration with CITIC. We also manage the Montserrat Volcano Observatory since 2008. Our network, as mentioned before, consists of a seismograph monitoring network, ground deformation, and gas monitoring in 9 islands, and we monitor 19 volcanoes. Our program of hazard mapping, basic geological investigations, help to improve the understanding of volcanic systems in the region. So we can move on to the next slide. So as mentioned before, our primary work involves monitoring, mitigation, and research and education into the hazards that we monitor. We provide the contributing territories with information and advice on the geological hazards, and we support disaster management agencies in public education efforts to improve the understanding of earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. So with this, our primary risk communication objectives have focused on reinforcing the local capacity of the, in each island there is a national disaster coordinator, and we work very closely with that agency. So part of our work involves reinforcing that local capacity So towards this, we have established positive relationships over these years and helped with active engagements. We provide regular scientific updates. We're involved in aligning our communication with the NDOs and providing access to a rich source of accurate and bespoke communication products. We also would like to be known as a creditable source of information. And so we have a consistent campaign of accurate and timely updates on volcanic activity, the monitoring techniques, and potential volcanic hazards. And we respond swiftly to queries and misinformation. We also use branded communication products and consistent messaging to do this. So through this, we hope to facilitate public understanding via a variety of multimedia products in accessible language to minimize the jargon, scientific jargon. And we use user-informed tools such as virtual community meetings, trail guides, short films, animations, teaching tools, and social media in order to do this. So we can move on. Right, so some of the natural hazards consideration in the Caribbean context. So of course we are looking at small island developing states, and they have several inherent characteristics that make it particularly challenging for development. One is which the Caribbean consists of several countries that exemplify the basic characteristics of SIDS, which in themselves pose challenges to sustainable development. The tectonic setting and geographical location makes it prone to multi-hazard environment. The region is prone to low-frequency, high-impact hazards, which can set back the development by several decades. And this is combined with sometimes a fatalistic attitude to hazards in the region, such as you would hear phrases like, disasters are an act of God, and God is a whatever country you live in, so it will not happen here. And this, combined with a relatively short history in terms of development as independent nations, make it more challenging to deal with this type of environment. So some additional considerations to keep in mind is that there are many other competing interests for limited resources. There is the ex-ante risk financing is, of course, woefully inadequate. We have a high volatility of key government establishments, which leads to overall poor risk governance and policy. And there are challenges to sustaining high level of hazard awareness, preparedness levels, because we are physically based in, partly because we're physically based in Trinidad, but we provide service to multiple islands. The additional challenge of having sensitive hazard-related information that may require authorities to respond in a certain way that may be unpopular, such as evacuation, calling an evacuation and an evacuation response. And there are certain government desire to minimize economic impact of science advisories on fragile tourism-based economies. So natural hazards damage as well, in terms of mitigation as part of the overall planning system, is not effectively reinforced. So this is just a quick summary of the hazard impact in the region in terms of the economic impact being at least 20% of the variation in real GDP growth in the Eastern Caribbean, and has been identified by the ECCB, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, as a key factor in contributing to instability in foreign reserve earnings in the region. So this slide gives a very, very quick overview of why volcanic eruptions and how they've been a challenge in the region or experienced by all of the islands that we monitor. So it can be noted that every island has had at least one volcanic seismic crisis, with the most southern islands in the arc having more frequent episodes of unrest. Volcanic risk management, planning, and awareness activities, therefore, are primary volcanic hazard mitigation strategies implemented by the Seismic Research Center. These activities include the preparation of volcanic hazard maps, compilation and use of comprehensive geological and volcanological data set for each island, as well as the development of the volcanic alert level system for each island. So we would next focus on a couple more recent examples of volcanic activity in the region. First one would be from La Soufrière in St. Vincent. So La Soufrière in St. Vincent, in terms of its historical activity, has had both explosive and effusive eruptions. As listed here, explosive activity has happened in, well, more recently, 1902, 1979, and 2020, 2021. We've had effusive eruptions in 1784, 1971 to 72. But what is interesting is that there is a narrow compositional range for the magmas, which is mainly basaltic andesites. And the repose period between eruptions has systematically decreased in more recent times. So given that context, what has happened in the last 5 years prior to the eruption in 2020, there was investment by both the Seismic Research Center, which was funded by the Caribbean Development Bank, along with the local authorities and other agencies in St. Vincent, to work on this project called Volcano Ready Communities Project. It involved working with at least 20 communities living on the flanks of the volcanoes, with a focus on about 5 of them, to develop community emergency response plans, to have simulations of evacuations. We developed these community emergency warehouse is where they were provided with essential response equipment, and there was capacity building training in terms of community readiness using community volunteers. And all of this happened prior to the 2020-2021 eruption, such that when this event began in December of 2020, we were in a position where, given our long-standing relationship with both the government as well as the public in St. Vincent, we were in a good position to be able to provide the information and have it accepted by the community. So this is a kind of a brief timeline of the events that occurred during the 2020-2021 eruption, with the emergence of the dome in late December, 27th of December, and then having about 3 months of effusive activity, followed by increased seismic activity, leading to a warning on the 8th of April based on that heightened seismicity and visual observations that indicated an imminent explosive eruption. The warning was provided to the government, and the alert level was raised to red, and an immediate evacuation order was issued by the government of St. Vincent to people in the red and orange zones. And the eruption transitioned to an explosive eruption on the 9th of April, with multiple Volcanian and subplinian explosions occurring. We recorded at least 32 discrete events that generated plumes, sometimes of over 15 kilometers or more above the volcano, and the resultant ash thickness was up to 15 centimeters across the island, with the weight of the ash damaging roofs, affecting structural damage in terms of infrastructure. There was damage to agricultural crops, disrupted livestock production, and of course subsequent production of generation of lahars, with the continually remobilization of the ash with heavy rainfall events that happened after the eruption. In March of 2022, the alert level was lowered to green. Now, while the seismicity had significantly decreased about 3 months after the last explosive eruption on the 22nd of April, we still had to have the alert level raised to orange and then to yellow, not so much because of an immediate threat from the volcano, but this was, remember, the alert level system in the regions that we monitor, they are controlled, so to speak, by the governments. And it was to prevent a reoccupation of the areas that were impacted whilst the infrastructure and the development and the assessments were done to prevent people from moving back in to the affected areas. So that had to be managed carefully between ourselves and the authorities in order to allow safe reoccupation. So some of the immediate impacts of the 2020-2021 eruption included the displacement of over 18,000 people. So there was, of course, a large feeding budget of over $1 million US. People could not go back to their homes for months after the eruption was declared over, with over 4,000 people continuing to live in shelters. And there was limited access to clean water and electricity. The airports and the seaports had to close for several days during the eruption because, of course, the island was covered in ash. And there were further environmental concerns resulting from the eruption, including the management of the ash in terms of its cleanup, storage, utilization, and disposal, with the considerations for the physical and chemical properties of the ash. So, and of course, there was the loss of electronic and electrical appliances and the waste stemming from the humanitarian response that was necessary after the explosive eruption. So in terms of some of the management challenges, of course, this eruption took place during the COVID-19 pandemic and required certain protocols to be followed. As a matter of fact, the islands were in lockdown, borders were closed, so we had to go through certain levels of security systems in order to facilitate travel, because there was no travel between the islands, and that was where the regional security system came into play. There was no vaccines at the time, COVID vaccines, so that was also a concern, with staff having to quarantine and rotation on island having to be carefully managed to prevent the spread of the infection to both the staff, so that we can continue to do what we were doing, as well as the perception of the eruption that would remain effusive. It was insufficient, so there was insufficient individual preparedness to some degree. What was a big concern was that the request for aid, both for monitoring equipment as well as for preparation in the event of the eruption becoming explosive, that was not being seen as a priority by the global community, aid community, because what was surprising is that during the effusive phase, of course, there was a perception that the danger was only confined to the dome and it did not pose a risk to the surrounding communities. And so this meant that when it transitioned to an explosive eruption, there had to be very rapid changes in the way that aid came in and the assistance was provided. But then you were also dealing with closed ports, airports and seaports. So this is just a message to show how we've progressed in many ways, but there are still certain things in terms of management of crisis that need to be considered, particularly when it comes to volcanoes. So, of course, there was the increasing physical risk to the monitoring staff, because only access that we had was actually walking up the flanks of the volcano. There was no helicopter support except for a very brief period, which we utilized mainly to strengthen the monitoring network in a week. After this, everything was done by physically. There was any monitoring of the dome had to be done by physical visits to the dome. Yes, there was a camera, but that does not take measurements. It's the people going up there. So as the dome became bigger and bigger, this became more of a challenge to monitor in terms of managing that risk to staff, as well as the benefits of learning, of course, and understanding more about the processes and how things were developing. There was the possibility of this rapid change in volcanic activity that had to be managed, and the lahars, of course, continued to be a problem because the hurricane season came on very rapidly after that. So these were some of the management challenges that were encountered. So next we look at another study. This is the Soufriere Hills, Montserrat, 1995 to present. And there were, prior to the 1995 onset of the eruption, there was long expected and clear signs of volcanic activity, pre-volcanic seismic activity, with monitoring symptoms starting in the late 19th century. Since the 1960s, the SRC had prepared maps and did, of course, what we usually do. There was the maps, the hazard mapping, the outreach and the monitoring that highlighted the potential risk to local and UK authorities, as well as the population residing in Montserrat. But in 1995, when the volcano started to erupt, there was no advanced preparation made by the local authorities. And unfortunately, 12 years after the last impactful volcanic activity in 2010, when there was a partial collapse of the dome, we still sometimes see a lack of awareness of the volcanic hazards, although the eruption has not been declared over. So some of the ways that we look at to ensure that history does not repeat itself, for example, include that continued education and outreach program that ensure local volcanic history and its impact is taught at the school levels, particularly primary schools, and to ensure a harmonized communication strategy and close collaboration between the scientists and the local authorities, and to secure funding for the ongoing monitoring of a very long-term eruption. So when we look at volcanic assessment of disaster risk in a region, of course there's a shared ownership in the decision making and the transparency in risk assessment, and issues of trust, risk perception, and the perception gaps and the data available show that there are insufficiencies, and they can be resolved by having a better investment in these areas going forward. So some of the global lessons learned from looking at similar crises around the world is that stakeholders should be kept in a loop at all status of the activity of the volcanoes. Stakeholders should be made aware and periodically reminded of the challenges and limitations that the monitoring agency faces. There is value in developing meaningful relationships and working on these with the disaster management community and vulnerable communities. The knowledge and sharing of the language of stakeholders is essential between the scientists and the agencies that they support. The promotion and development of plans and protocols and practice among community is important, and we must be ready to adapt and adjust as the need to manage a particular situation evolves. So looking back at some of the operational challenges and strategies of our monitoring agencies that has been in existence for almost 70 years, is that our funding, of course, has been inconsistent and deficient, with several governments not paying on time or not paying at all. And this reflects, unfortunately, the low GDP per capita of the contributing territories. How we've adapted to this is by seeking grants and partnerships and collaborations with regional and international universities and agencies. We, of course, have the logistical challenge of operating over a large geographical space and independent territories. So we've developed a number of remote monitoring techniques, as well as building local technical capacity in each island. So we actually have hands-on in each island to help do things like simple checks and monitoring repairs if needed, and then if something more intense is required or more technical is required, then we fly out as needed. There are long repose periods between the volcanic eruptions, as we said before, and that leads to complacency in the general public and by local authorities somewhat. This, of course, leads to a lower commitment in the funding. So the sustainable education and outreach programs come into play there. And the impact of hydromet hazards, of course, we spoke about the multi-hazard environment of the region and the seasonal hurricanes on a yearly basis. This has led to us looking at more low-cost instruments to improve the low-cost instruments so that we can, rapidly repair and maintain the network based on, yearly losses, and to improve the actual robustness of the installations by the type of installations that are done, as well as the actual equipment used. Looking at things like the VSAT communications and so on to make sure that during times of hazards, communication is constant and continuous. And of course, there is vandalism. There's also a problem with field deployed scientific equipment in remote sites. So how we've tried to address that is by having enhanced public education awareness and sometimes improved security at the sites themselves. So some considerations for the future. So in the Caribbean as a whole, limited resources and lack of political will, combined with inconsistent enforcement of laws and the need to shift in culture from a focus on hurricanes, preparedness to comprehensive all hazards disaster management approach are seen as some of the biggest obstacles to our success. So looking at governance and policy, any initiative for building resilience is only as successful as the underlying governance. And moving forward, hopefully there would be more input by decision makers to the preparation of position papers and so on to address this at the highest levels. Of course, funding. Caribbean governments must support and make full use of existing competent regional institutions with proven ability to generate knowledge and information at the regional level. Of course, continuing to build partnerships at all levels, regionally and internationally, and to engage communities and stakeholders to do demand-driven research. And of course, the local knowledge and capacity is rich in potential for developing and dealing with poverty, environmental and disaster risk management, but it has too frequently been disregarded. So just to sum up by saying, in spite of all of this, of course, we live in a volcanic environment, and there are many benefits to this. Not only do they provide a rich fertile soils, and of course build new land, they also provide valuable mineral deposits. They're a source of recreation and tourism, income generation. They're a source of geothermal energy, and that is becoming more and more something that's being explored in all of the islands in the region, the volcanic islands, and they provide a habitat for unique flora and fauna. So thank you. There is a need to balance the economic benefits of accessing these resources with the risk to individuals in potentially hazardous areas. So that is the end of my presentation for today. So if you have any questions, we can
Hello, and congratulations for your talk. I'd like to know a little bit more about the relative economic importance of volcano hazards compared to other natural catastrophes.
So in terms of the economic impacts, as I mentioned during the talk, it is within that 20% of the GDP in terms of the economic impacts for the island. But this is combined with, of course, other hazards such as the hurricanes and so on. In terms of the separation between the two, I'm not familiar with the differentiation of each type of hazard within that 20%, but geohazards in general represent 20% of the economic loss annually to territories.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much, Pat, for this excellent presentation. And also thank you to SRC for all the data that it contributes, but also all the expertise it contributes and really helped advance, earthquake, volcano, tsunami warning systems in the Caribbean. You do an incredible job with, as you say, extremely limited resources. So just first I'd like to say thank you. Second of all, I'd like to, in there you talked about collaboration and joint work, and you also mentioned your active participation in the tsunami warning system for the region. And I just wanted your opinion or to share. We have a challenge with our tsunami warning system that is a tsunami warning system that's designed basically around earthquakes that are going to generate the tsunami. So if we detect the earthquake, then we'll be able to warn and timely warn and advise people of the tsunami threat. but in the Caribbean, over 10% of our tsunamis have actually been generated by volcanic activity. And our tsunami warning centers really do not have the data to be able to detect and know when a volcano has erupted. And therefore, we depend on institutions like you and the volcano observatories that you operate. And how feasible do you see? There's a proposal that the volcano observatories of the Caribbean would be advising the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center as the tsunami service provider for the region on status reports, and let us know that, look, a volcano's erupted, look, there's been a flank collapse, look, there could be a tsunami. So basically being our seismometer. What do you need? What would Seismic Research Center need to be able to be that function as our eyes on volcanoes and its potential in generating a tsunami, so then the Tsunami Warning Center can then issue the products through the procedures that we have established? Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. So that is a really important question. So I can start with our recent experience with La Soufrière and what happened at La Soufrière St. Vincent. So one of the first things that we do when a volcano starts to exhibit above background levels is we have a report of activities, and this goes to certain levels of stakeholders because, of course, increased activity doesn't necessarily escalate to an eruption. So depending on how things develop, we certainly communicate that to certain stakeholders, and that is where these reports then began going out to local and regional authorities, as well as the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center and the CITIC. So that became one of the key things. The second thing was that while we were dealing with 19 volcanoes, so of course to have a dense and robust monitoring network on the volcano itself is a critical monitoring tool, obviously. And that was rapidly done for St. Vincent, but it is not the case for, yes, while there is monitoring, the density of the networks need to be improved on the different volcanoes in order to detect events that are potentially tsunamigenic, and to be able to give us enough lead time to be able to provide these warnings and these reports of activity to the region, the PTWC and other responding agencies. And then, of course, there's a separate thing of tide gauges located near two volcanoes that can impact the coastlines and and generate tsunamis. So that's another thing that could be used in the future, because as with St. Vincent, there was a tide gauge that was installed, but it happened just after the eruption and not before or during. So in terms of the usefulness there, I mean, the good thing is that it's there and it will be used in the future. But having, think of these kind of things in preparation for events from volcanic tsunami-generated events are important to consider moving forward. I hope this answers your question. Mm-hmm.
Is there any other question?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you so much, and I will be here. So if you want to speak, we can, catch up during breaks or any time that you're available. And thank you very much for attending and your time. Take care.
Thank you.